Good morning. Thanks, everyone. Hope you had some nice conversations digging into some of the many seeds that have been planted so far. So welcome to our keynote session for today. Today's keynote is by the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, the moderator of the United Church of Canada. And she's going to be giving a talk entitled #LandBack, Reclaiming the Commons for a Future Not Our Own. And the respondent to her talk will be John Thatamanil. And I'll introduce John first and then Carmen. John is our diocesan theologian in the Diocese of Islands and Inlets and professor of theology and world religions at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He kind of goes between New York City and Victoria, and we're blessed to have him in his role as diocesan theologian. Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, as I said, is the moderator of the United Church of Canada. She is a member of the Celtic First Nation and has a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, where she focused on Indigenous epistemologies and theology. She's the first Indigenous woman to lead a major denomination in Canada, and before that was the executive director at First United in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where they undertook a fairly major, it's in process, major redevelopment project on that property, which is very relevant to some of our conversation here as well. She has served in the past on the executive committee of the World Council of Churches, and we actually first met in person in Karlsruhe, Germany at the last General Assembly. And she might just be one of the busiest women in the country. I follow her on Instagram and she's just all over the place in her role as moderator. And so we're very grateful and blessed that she has carved out the time for us today to engage in this important topic. So, Carmen.
Yo, heerstach nugwa. Gagwegi lau la nugwa. Quisala la nugwa. Guthla nugwa la tu kukutlim. Hello, my traditional names are Gagwegi Lauk, which in Heistchachla means dear one, and Quisala, which in Kwakwala means woman who travels to places far away. I was an adult when my adopted brother Rick gave me that name. So now when my mom and I sit down and have coffee with him at home in Alert Bay, she looks at him and says, "It's all your fault." Also a huge endorsement of your executive director here in the diocese. Brendan wrote to me like a year ago. So when it was clear that I might be the only nominee for moderator of the United Church of Canada, before I was elected and installed, and definitely before my calendar got busy. So it was easy to honor what Dean Peter Elliott used to call the Ministry of First Commitments. It is my great pleasure to be with you for these couple of days to talk about the theme for this year's John Albert Hall Lectures, Law, Land, Religion, and Reconciliation. What a perfect topic for a Heistchach woman who originally wanted to go to law school out of undergrad, to specialize in Aboriginal law and land claims, ended up director of operations at a national environmental law charity, EcoJustice, with a PhD in interdisciplinary studies in Christian mission and Indigenous epistemologies, where the topic of my dissertation was incorporating traditional ways into the mission of the church as a form of reconciliation. So thank you to Brendan and to Dr. Kathy Chan for their patience and persistence in arranging for me to be here with you for the lectures this year, and to Noriko for all of the logistics, and to our speakers this morning and last night, and to Elder Sam for your beautiful prayer and song this morning, and to those who will follow this afternoon. As I mentioned, I am a member of the Heistchach First Nation, which is our main village site now is Bella Bella in the central coast of British Columbia. But I used to joke in high school that I was an urban Indian from the Yuppie tribe living on the Oak Bay Reserve. As an off-reserve Indigenous person, I grew up far from both the Heistch motherlands of the Central Coast and from the traditional Kwakwaka'wakw northern territories of northern Vancouver Island and the Broughton Archipelago, which is the land of my birth and also where my heart lives. I mean, there's no other Heistch here, are there? Okay, yeah, it's where my heart lives. There are, as is caricatured ad infinitum in public discourse these days, strong ties between Indigenous people and the lands where we are from. And it's actually something I think I included in the title of this talk, but I won't go too much into detail around the idea of the commons. So one of the main characteristics between Indigenous peoples of this continent and the newcomers who arrived and settled here over the past 500 plus years is that our societies were and are collectivist in nature. Despite the pressures of Euro-Christian hegemony that have tried to kill that part of us in explicit and implicit ways. So my heart lives in Alert Bay, the village where I was born and where my parents are living again, where I have my best memories of outdoor play and the safety of a grandfather who cherished me and who was also of that land as a settler newcomer, and who was a logger and a fisherman and knew the land intimately, as does my father. The first time I visited the areas surrounding Bath and Bristol, England, I knew in my body intuitively that my people, the Lansdowne people, were also from these lands, from where my great-grandfather had emigrated to homestead in British Columbia. The summer I was 17, I had just graduated from high school and I went home to Bella Bella for the first time that I had ever gone for more than a few days. The Heiltsuk Cultural Education Center had secured Canada's summer jobs grants and I got a job working there for the summer. And it was the first time I had a sort of immersion experience of getting to learn more about our culture and our language. It is also the experience that lit a flame in my heart about Indigenous rights and title. One of my assignments in the job was to go spy on some developers. A group of investors had purchased the last fee simple lots on Calvert Island, the most southerly island in our traditional territories that covers 25,000 linear kilometers of coastline in the Central Coast between Queen Charlotte Sound and Millbank Sound. The rest of Calvert Island had been preserved as a provincial park, and by law, BC Parks had the first right of refusal if those remaining lots were to be sold. We will never know why. They said no, that they didn't want to incorporate the lots into the park. And if it was outright racism or just the way of the hegemony of whiteness that causes people to make certain assumptions about what Indigenous people can or cannot do. But the good people at BC Parks in the early 1990s had failed to tell the seller that the Heistch Tribal Council had the right of second refusal for a fee simple purchase of our traditional lands that had been home to my grandfather's trapline as a young man. And so the private seller went on to broker a private sale to a group of investors who had planned to build a high-end eco-resort. By law, we had the right to gather traditional foods and medicines on this particular property, which made spying convenient. A group of 5 of us went, 2 of us having just graduated from high school, 2 older young adults, and an elder who was teaching us about traditional medicinal plants and how to harvest them. So it was a real win-win for me. We saw that the development had proceeded on the site of a midden, evidence that there had been human settlement there, something that we know because Heistch had only stopped regular seasonal use of that land when my maternal grandfather was a child, and our people had been so decimated by smallpox that we had settled permanently in what is now Bella Bella. We met the project manager, who obviously was very curious as to what we were doing on the resort site. And we cited whatever statute gave us permission to be gathering food and medicine, and we asked a lot of innocent questions. Obviously, the lodge was going to be for sports fishing. And since this conference is about the land and not the oceans, I won't go into the politics or economics of the tensions between Indigenous food fishing, Indigenous commercial fisheries, and sports fisheries. But needless to say, there wasn't a warm reception from our people for a non-Indigenous privately held sporty camp. Apologies to any sports fishermen in the room. We learned that they intended to build a world-class 18-hole golf course and also to develop the site as a dive resort. So nearby Hakai Pass has some of the best ocean diving in the world, but with its strong currents, it's really an adventure for only experienced divers. The interesting thing, and the stupid thing we thought, is that that island doesn't have enough fresh water to support the operations of the existing fishing lodge the way they'd planned them, let alone golf course maintenance. And so that was doomed from the start. And I believe that that building is now owned by UVic for the Hakai Environmental Research Center that is co-managed and operated by the Heiltsuk Tribal Council. So back to 1993, it was electrifying to suss out what the situation was. And I think eventually that they caught on to us that we were there for dual purposes. And they told us they couldn't control us being on the island, but for liability reasons, when we set up our tents, they had to be off of their demarked property and on the beach and away from any sheltered gathering. So this is where I had to camp for me. And I fell in love. West Beach of Calvert Island is still my favorite place on this planet. Aside from the magical beaches, which have been described as Canada's Caribbean, and the aforementioned world-class diving and fishing, Calvert Island has some of our oldest petroglyphs and pictographs, part of the archaeological record that proves our existence on that part of this coast for over 14,000 years. Just to put that into context, the Great Pyramids of Giza are about 8,000 years old. So despite not having grown up in Heiltsuk territory, and despite the fact that I say that my heart lives in Alert Bay, my body knows that it is home when I cross the Queen Charlotte Sound into the traditional territory of my people. So why am I talking about land back at a lecture series in the Department of Center for Religious Studies? I wrote that question before I heard all of the excellent speakers for the last 24 hours. But for starters, tying into Catherine's slide this morning, the United Church of Canada alone has property valued somewhere between $3 and $4 billion cumulatively across the country. The last time that we publicly reported it in our yearbook statistics. I didn't have time to find the date for when that was, but I know I had to fact check it for an article for Broadview magazine a couple of years ago. But as you saw in Kathy's slide, is a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall religious ownership of property in Canada. And no judgment about us very wealthy religious land barons. At least in the United Church, we are very, very house poor, like most other Canadian denominations. And I was whispering to Kate, I wonder the flip side of that data would be how many individual religious societies hold that cumulative amount. Because I imagine, each United Church of Canada congregation has its own CRA charitable registration number. And so, that's like thousands and thousands. We have almost 2,600 congregations across the country. We have congregations like Metropolitan United in downtown Toronto, which is going to be self-sustaining for forever because of how much land and endowment they have. And then, the church that I grew up attending in Alert Bay, which was an old pan abode house that was converted into a church and is now a bed and breakfast. Anyway, all of that property for Canada's biggest Protestant denomination is on unceded Indigenous land, treaty or not. And some of that land is held fee simple title in the middle of reserves across the country. So churches own land inside of reserves. And that's just one denomination. And somehow when the reservation system was set up, churches and communities were granted fee simple title to the lots owned by the church. And while Indigenous people on reserve can own real estate, as in the structures that are built on the land, they cannot own the lands themselves. They are held in trust for us by the Crown. And then that real estate can revert to the tribal council at the time of death unless there's a registered will bequeathing it to an eligible member, but even that can be vetoed by a tribal council. Pam Palmater, the Mi'kmaq lawyer from Toronto Metropolitan University, an Indigenous rights activist, describes the land back movement this way. It's literally about giving land back to Indigenous nations. And it's also resources back. It's waters back. It's about respecting sovereignty, our right to be self-determining, and our laws and jurisdiction over all of those lands that were wrongly taken from us. And it also includes making amends for all the lands we won't be able to get back and all the things that we lost from those territories. And while land back sounds new, it's basically the same thing we've been saying since shortly after first contact. Of course, in the mid-1990s, when I was at the Heiltsuk Cultural Education Center, land back wasn't really a movement. But you can see why, in the context of my coming of age during an intense period of comprehensive land claims processes, and not even then being an afterthought to land transfers happening in our own territory, that the question of what this very land-rich church should do in relation to the history of dispossession from our lands that is now forms Canada is a question that is near and dear to my heart as the spiritual leader of this church. The second formative instance was specific to the church's ownership and use of Indigenous lands, is specific to Alert Bay, where I was born. And it's so interesting that the story of Christchurch came up last night in your response, Kathy. When I was born, until I was about middle school age, there were three main churches in our thriving village of 2,500 people who lived there year round. The population would shoot up to just over 5,000 in the summers when the fishing fleet descended and loggers and others working in resource extraction in the Johnstone Straits descended on Alert Bay, then known as a quaint little drinking town with a fishing problem. My paternal great-grandmother's father, so my great-great-grandfather, paid for the construction of Christchurch Cathedral in Alert Bay so that my great-grandparents could be married there. I told this story last night about how they ended up on the lawn instead of inside of the church. We can talk about that more at lunch, but our family connection to that church may have been why my mom, inspired by the national Indigenous consultations that were happening ecumenically and in the United Church of Canada, was sort of taken, it's been her bugaboo always. Like every time I leave to go to a church meeting, she's like, and tell them to give us our land back. But she convinced a local politician's son that they should challenge the Anglican diocese to return the lots owned by Christchurch to the Namgis First Nation as an act of reparation based on principles of justice and equity. To its credit, the Anglican diocese did return the lots, and the church continues to exist on and operate on Namgis land. But I also learned last night from the bishop that the original resolution from the diocese was signed in 1984, and the process of doing it was so complicated that the lands weren't actually returned until 1995. When in the early 2000s, my parents moved back to my mom's hometown of Bella Bella, she questioned why the lots for the manse and the church in Bella Bella had not been returned from the United Church to the Heiltsuk Tribal Council. There was at first outright resistance on the part of the regional church that turned into openness, that turned into creative resistance, and those lots have not yet been returned to the Heiltsuk 15 years later. I'm going to switch a little bit and offer my deep gratitude at this point to Dr. Seljak for his lecture last evening, and it was really instructive for me in terms of the history of the intersectionality of land, law, and religion in Canada. And in particular, I appreciated the problem creates solutions, creates a new situation and new problems, new solutions, and repeat that process until the second coming. Second, I liked the outline of the consequences that Christian Canada became the problem and Canadian Christians contributed and in some contexts led to the secularization of Canada. My more recent experience in United Church leadership before becoming moderator was taking over the then beleaguered First United Church Community Ministry Society and First United Church Social Housing Society in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And one of the draws for me, due to a series of random work experiences over my career, was the opportunity to support the community in an audacious redevelopment project to ensure that we were in a position to best meet the needs of Canada's poorest urban postal code. One of the challenges I had, besides the handicap of starting to effect an organizational turnaround from decline to growth after a decade of unplanned deficits that had eaten away a significant portion of their savings, and the building was that the building had far outlived its useful life. The pressure was on me to just get the new building built. There was an expectation of the board that we should be able to fundraise to cover an equity gap, but their preference would have been to find a way to build a new building that provided all the funding needed for the church to get a new building. There was little interest in strategic planning, even though we were at the end of the previous strategic plan, and there was a great pressure to work with the developer who would push through and build a turnkey building as fast as possible. But if there's anything I have learned from one of my mentors turned friends, Martha Burton, one of the founders of Tides Canada, which is now Make Way Foundation, Renewal Partners, and the Social Purpose Real Estate Collaborative, is that form follows function. While our staff were tired and disillusioned and had a lot of conflict with previous management, the board were also tired. They didn't want to do strategic planning, but I insisted. So as senior staff, we led a new strategic planning process, working with the board to answer some big questions like, if the community of the marginalized we work with was physically displaced by the city or the province and moved to another city or neighborhood, would we follow them? Would we follow them and serve them there? Or were we really about being committed to preserving the presence of the United Church of Canada on the corner of Hastings and Gore in the downtown east side, even if that community became fully gentrified? Do we want market housing, mixed housing, transitional housing, a new permanent shelter? The temptation was strong to just fix the problem, but we know through so much of the good management science that you've learned in the MBA program, right, Bishop? That form does indeed follow function. So you have to know who you are and where you're going to build the right thing. And especially if you want that thing to last 60 to 80 years. The end result was that we listened deeply to the community we served. We tried our best to accommodate their greatest needs, but designed the building in a way that could be flexible into the future. We did all of this within the constraints set for me by the board. Their ends were that the church maintain 100% ownership of the entire building, if at all possible. That First United not operate the housing, because, as I said, I was also the executive director of our housing society, which we actually just wound down and merged into another housing provider that had more experience and better track record than us. But they also wanted to maximize affordability, including maximizing the amount of apartments that were available at the shelter rate, which is $375 a month. That's a really, really challenging math problem. This building is going to cost almost $100 million. And when I started, like in May 2019, we had a burn rate of about $330,000 a month in operating costs. And there was 1 week in May 2019 when we had $2,200 in our operating account. My director of finance was like, nobody breathes unless I say so. So we sort of like rode the plane down right almost to the ground, and then we were able to pull up, and I'm happy to say that First United is in a much, much better financial position now, having had 3 years of operating surpluses, and we've raised the first $27 million we need to cover the $37 million we'll need for our portion of the building. To address the critical housing, health, and social justice needs of the community, we partnered with Luma Native Housing Society to redevelop the site into a multi-story purpose-built space that will offer 4 floors of community amenities, programs, and services, as well as 103 units of below-market rental housing for Indigenous people. Based on extensive consultation with our downtown east side neighbors, our project is informed by the community for the community. And we're extremely excited to build a space that provides healing, connection, and care that our community so desperately needs. The building has 2 drop-in spaces, a large dining room and commercial kitchen, a legal advocacy clinic, multi-purpose spaces, public showers, a day sleeping room for people who are unhoused, an interfaith sacred space, outdoor space that is just for people experiencing homelessness, so they have somewhere beautiful to be outside that is just for them, where they're not going to be asked to move along. A community computer lab, so they can have access to the internet and taking care of, doing their taxes or checking their CRA account or applying for income assistance, all of which you can only do mostly online. The only request we had from the community that we couldn't accommodate, mostly because we lost half of our ground floor to zoning requirements about where our driveway would be replaced, was a public laundromat. We launched a $30 million capital campaign, and in the first year, we raised $27 million. Of course, as it goes with construction, there were delays getting started, nasty hazmat surprises that resulted in a $3 million overrun just for that line item before the building could even be decommissioned. And now we expect, as I said, the church's portion to be about $37 million. But they're well underway and optimistic that there has been such overwhelming support from Vancouver and from across the country, really. And we will end up with a building that we designed. But I see other churches looking to redevelop their properties as a function of the exact cycle that Dr. Seldrak accurately, so articulately stated last night. There's the problem of a diminished and diminishing church. Redevelopment is seen as a solution, which creates a new situation. You have a new building with the same people doing the same things inside it, which creates a new set of problems. And largely, these rushes to the miracles of redevelopment to solve for the future of the church can result in huge financial losses and, surprise, surprise, disappointed parishioners whose problems weren't solved by that solution. This dynamic is made all the worse by the need to try and meet the social needs we see growing at what seems like an unusually rapid increase in terms of homelessness, mental illness, substance use, and entrenched poverty, all of which were socially conditioned to see as individual moral failure, rather than what social theorist Saskia Sassen would call a massive expulsion in end-stage capitalism. Sassen explains that the notion of expulsions takes us beyond the more familiar idea of growing inequality as a way of capturing the pathologies of today's global capitalism. Stan Goff, the American anti-war activist and former armed serviceman, critiques the use of what we use often in the environmental movement, the term Anthropocene era, that has become popular with scholars critiquing capitalism, especially its end-stage tendencies to cause so many of these expulsions. In his most recent book, Mammon's Ecology, he writes, "When we call this era of climate change the Anthropocene era, literally made by humans, we conceal the fact that industrial capitalism is the specific social organization that led to both the overcarbonization of the atmosphere and to the abrupt outgrowth of general human population beginning in the 16th century, taking off with the industrial expansion in the early 19th century, then at a far steeper rate after World War II. When we say, as some environmentalists do, we have a population problem, we are excusing the consumption of the rich person in the United States and making the Afghani peasant equally responsible. Some have suggested that this instead be called the Capitalocene era. Calling it a human-made problem or a population problem is a way of naturalizing the issue, spreading the blame to all and pretending it's just a natural part of the process as a way of immunizing powerful people and their political economic structures from criticism. While their work doesn't intersect, I tend to think that Sassen would agree. Highly critical of the ways in which the function of global finance impacts humans and the planet in exploitative ways, Sassen argues that, quote, "In the case of finance, its organizing logic has evolved into a relentless push for hyperprofits and a need to develop instruments that enable it to expand the range of what can be financialized," end quote. Lalani Farha, Canadian human rights lawyer and former UN Special Rapporteur on Housing, see, Mr. Poilievre, it's not a made-up job title, defines the financialization of housing specifically this way, quote, By the financialization of housing, I mean when single and multifamily homes are treated like an extractive industry like mining, where housing is used to extract wealth, mostly by those who already have an abundance of it. Why this is important, and the reason I used housing as an example of the Capitalocene era drive for extractive wealth and its resulting expulsions, is because it is systemic, like a computer virus. There is very little that we can do. It's not a supply and demand issue only. It's not a welfare reform issue only. We cannot fix the housing affordability crisis and the resulting expulsions that are happening without complete monetary policy reform in this country, like closing not tax avoidance, tax evasion, closing tax evasion loopholes, prosecuting tax evaders, returning to stronger financial market regulations, and other public policies that protect our social foundations. And the resistance to it is super, super high. Because of course, the bigger Canadian companies and wealthier families profit. And the more that those companies profit, the greater our GDP, which is our primary measurement of economic health, despite the risks to our planet and to people. Sasson explains her thesis, quote, is that we are seeing the making of not so much predatory elites, but of predatory formations, a mix of elites and systemic capacities with finance as a key enabler that pushes towards acute concentration. Rich individuals and global firms by themselves could not have achieved such extreme concentrations of the world's wealth. They need what we might think of as systemic help, a complex interaction of these actors with systems re-geared towards enabling extreme concentration. Such systemic capacities are a variable mix of technical, market, and financial innovations plus government enablement, end quote. And it's pervasive. It's our pension funds. Our pension funds are huge drivers of the housing unaffordability crisis because of all of the financial derivatives and REITs that we invest in, because real estate is a good investment. If you think about the social movements over the past 20 to 30 years, including the Occupy movement that brought into sharp relief the liquidity of global capital and the concentration of increasing amounts of wealth in the 1% of the 1%. We are also socially conditioned to name individual people or classes of people like billionaires or corporations of being at fault. But if it is not, in fact, easy to name rich individuals or global firms who are alone at fault, how do we pull at the thread of those predatory formations that mix the money of global elites with that technical market and financial innovation so that we can unravel and slow its machinations? And when we fail to do so, it results in a type of economic feedback loop. The losers of much of this, Sasson identifies, are the majority of citizens and their governments. Governments become poorer, largely as a result of tax evasion, and partly because more of their citizens are impoverished and therefore less capable of meeting their social obligations to pay their taxes. When we consider the questions of what to do with land, including considering giving it back to Indigenous people, I think we often think too small. Not that our intentions are small, but we think about the individual or corporate actions that are possible, not stepping back far enough to see those systemic predatory formations of the Capitalocene. But if we don't, we risk failure to change the trend of those increasing expulsions based on the financialization of everything, but especially housing and land. Ironically, I think, by considering redevelopment of church property, we are perpetuating the same unhealthy dynamics, even when our own intention is to create a benefit for the communities we serve. When we sell our properties to reinvest the proceeds elsewhere, we risk one of two things happening. We replicate the same problem in a new situation, usually continuing to run our ministries on deferred maintenance and deficits that eat away at our savings because we have fewer and fewer people in the pews. Or two, we build a beautiful new building without addressing that without people in our pews, we end up like the government's who lose and Sasson's model. The churches become impoverished and less capable of meeting its obligations. And then we want to take the proceeds of the sale of other properties to keep these beautiful new buildings that we've created. So we have new problems from the new situations. It reminds me of that Star Trek trope, resistance is futile. And the most infuriating idea is that despite the cycling from problem solving to new situation to problems to new situations until we meet Jesus, the whole cycle is still predicated on a colonialist model that garnered billions of dollars in land and real estate value to the church in the first place. We hear over and over again, the time is now to listen to the wisdom of indigenous cultures in order to save ourselves and the planet. But look at how hard it was to successfully or unsuccessfully return a few paltry lots on 2 reserves to Crown land to be held in trust for our people. But just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth it to try and to imagine the ways in which a successful land back movement could start to disrupt some of those predatory functions at end stage capitalism. And why not consider it? Because if we resurrect the church, or if the church as an institution dies, which in all honesty it might, the story of Jesus will not die. We will always have followers of Jesus, but the institution of the church might die. Regardless of whether we succeed or if we fail, anything less than a new worldview is just playing with the fires of excessive profit-seeking and exploitation of people on the planet. In closing, I want to share with you the best disruption that is most aligned with traditional Indigenous values that I've seen. And it's from Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, How to Think Like a 21st Century How to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. So this is her donut model. You can't really see it super well. So you can see the 2 dark green concentric circles, and the inside circle is our social foundations. And the outside circle is what she calls our planetary boundaries or ecological ceiling. And inside in the light green, she has things like water, food, health, education, income and work, peace and justice, political voice, social equity, gender equality, housing, networks, and energy as sort of the metrics where we can track our economic interactions with each other. And so she argues when we have shortfalls on our social foundations, so our governance with each other, of how we're going to live politically and socially with each other, we have shortfalls that fall inside of that, it's resulting in this idea of these expulsions. But when we also exceed our planetary boundaries, which you can see that we are doing in terms of climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, freshwater withdrawals, land conversion, biodiversity loss, air pollution, and ozone layer depletion, we overshoot our planetary boundaries. We're like living outside of our environmental budgets, so to speak. And so her goal in presenting this donut of this, green circle is that we want to try to live in the green circle, in what she calls the just and safe center. And I love it also because it's a circular model, which is much more in line with our traditional ways of thinking. So in my dissertation, one of the things that I talked about was the difference between Euro-Christian perspectives on history and Indigenous perspectives on history, where like the European Western model is have this like chronological progression of time where you prove things by like objective facts. And in our traditional cultures, time was seen as cyclical, and the purpose of history was pedagogical and ethical. So the facts of your stories could change depending on what you wanted to teach people about how to be in relationship with each other and with the planet. And so I love it that this model is also a circle because it captures the dynamism of all of the intersections of the isms and the challenges we have in maintaining our social foundations and also living within our planetary boundaries in the capitalocene. So whether we consider the question of land from a religious or a legal perspective, I agree with Robert that this is the model we need to examine our economic decisions. So why not entrust the communities who thought naturally in these circular ways to help guide decisions about how to best disrupt this world order that seems to have doomed us to annihilation? Why not listen, like really listen to Indigenous people? As we start to see the confluence of Indigenous traditional wisdom with 21st century science, there is exponentially increasing affirmation of how the intimacy of our relationships with our traditional motherlands are proven by what we now know about science. And so it should not just be a trope of Indigenous people are the true stewards of this land or the historical stewards of this land, because that automatically evokes a feeling of past tense. Because since the infantilization of Indigenous peoples under the Indian Act, anything that was of value that was once known is automatically relegated to the chronological past. And then the intergenerational legacy of residential schools reinforces an implicit assumption that we have lost what the Indian Act tried to deny us. But because we are resilient, a lot of our stories and our oral histories are, although they are sleeping, are slowly awakening. The more that we work at our own healing from the trauma of colonization and residential institutions, the more people's bodies are remembering what we learned in really embodied ways from our elders, even if we weren't aware of it at the time, or even if trauma has blocked it out. I could talk for a few more hours, and I'm not even sure actually that my ideas are fully baked yet, or at least not in a way that can be condensed clearly into 5,000 words or less on my moderator's travel schedule, where I have not been home for more than like 4 consecutive nights in the last 2 months. So I'm going to stop there and we can hear from John, and then hopefully we can have some time for discussion.
Friends, it's really wonderful to be with you. See so many friendly faces in the audience. I want to begin by thanking Reverend Dr. Lansdowne for her deep and probing lecture, and of course also to thank Elder May Sam for beginning us in the right way. I want to take my remarks, my bearing for my remarks from this line from Dr. Lansdowne's lecture. Because if we resurrect the church, or if the church as an institution dies, which in all honesty it might, regardless of if we succeed or fail, anything less than a new worldview is just playing with the fires of excessive profit-seeking and exploitation of people and the planet. When it comes to the details of the economics involved, you know, I'm a lowly theologian. I'm quickly lost. But if you start talking to me about a new worldview, then I'm like, okay, that's my job. So hence I'm very grateful, particularly for that strand of your argumentation. The lecture we just heard offered a profound and serious engagement with big global issues around the most recent turns in global capitalism, particularly financialization. Even us lowly non-mathematical theologians, whose math goes 1 + 1 + 1 = 1. I mean, you know, how does that even work? You don't want us to trust us with the math. Even us theologians know enough to know that particularly in North America, the industrial capitalism has fundamentally declined as manufacturing has left for other parts of the world where labor is cheaper. This has created any number of critical problems, many of which were named, including the disappearance of work for growing numbers of persons. This is increasingly affecting not just working classes, but also the middle class. Until relatively recently, this transformation of capitalism away from industrial capitalism largely was a phenomena of decline in physical labor. But if you haven't noticed, I suspect you will soon, all the news that we're hearing now about the development of AI suggests that we'll see a rapid increase in the further decline in labor opportunities as intellectual labor also becomes computerized. And that's bad news, including for lawyers. I think lawyers are perhaps picking this up faster than maybe others of us, as increasingly there are forms and AI structures that are present that no longer require an actual lawyer present to fill out the relevant forms and automate the paperwork. Well, no, it's already happening, sadly. So this is to say that the decline of industrial capitalism is taking another turn, right? Not just the loss of physical labor, but intellectual labor is also happening. This means growing numbers of people simply don't have work to do. This will require a radical reimagination of our entire social order as we move further and further into a workless society. I don't think I'm exaggerating in the slightest. As Carmen has shown in her lecture, the decline of industrial capitalism has also caused problems for capitalists. How will profit be generated now that industry cannot be the primary basis of wealth generation? This has been a problem for more than well, maybe not quite a century, but at least 70 to 80 years. As the work of Carmen and Jason, whom we'll hear, Jason McKinney, where are you? Oh, there you are. As we'll hear from him later, both of them are teaching me that the solution that capitalist classes are coming up with is financialization. If you can't generate wealth by means of industry, you're going to have to find it elsewhere. And the solution that is currently in operation is investment in rent seeking. How to generate wealth now? Well, among other things, particularly as pertains to this conversation, reading Jason's work last night, I realized that you invest in property. Then you expel people currently living in a given property. After you develop the property and the price point for that property, then you charge far more rent for the same parcel of land, all of which is sometimes summed up under the category of gentrification. Without thinking, and that's how you try to make money now, right? When you're not making money by selling a particular profit, by manufacturing at a lower cost than you can sell it, right? The traditional forms of industrial capitalism. That's not what's happening anymore. It's this financialization in which property and the development of property plays a key role. So I think what Carmen has shown us, that without thinking through the systematic challenges introduced by such global forces, thinking meaningfully about relationships between Canada's churches and Indigenous peoples as it pertains to land will be woefully short-sighted. We are likely to be outplayed by forces before which we are mere pawns. But as Kathy Chan's presentation of numbers showed us this morning, we are not actually mere pawns. I mean, we hold billions in wealth that, as it happens, is not our own, given how we came to have that land. So I see Carmen's lecture as situating our thinking within this vast frame, and I'm profoundly grateful for that work. As someone who works primarily in the frame of interreligious dialogue, I am remarkably ill-suited to talk about these profound questions about the configuration of global capitalism. What I am positioned to take note of is that we are in a situation in which we need searching forms of interreligious dialogue. That might sound surprising to you. What does interreligious dialogue have anything to do with all the forces that you just mapped, John? Well, I'll try to explain. We have heard repeatedly since yesterday and this morning that the crisis that we are living through is a crisis of foundational principles. That's what Roshan said this morning. In other words, we are facing a crisis in imagination. We have to go back to founding principles. When the lawyers are telling us to do theology, maybe we should listen. Right? So this is a powerful and unmissable theme of the conversation thus far. We need new foundational imaginative structures and possibilities. The framing structures of our lives are falling apart. They are undergoing a process of performative reductio ad absurdum. Like, you keep living this way, and the material consequences of living this way unmasks the profound falsities of the root imaginative frame that you are operating with. As a result, the very possibility of human survival and species survival is now at stake. The scale of the crisis is so comprehensive that we are being pushed to realize that the way we have imagined our lives, our relationship to each other, to land, to nature, to God, have to be re-examined. That's what we're hearing from everyone who has spoken thus far. That means we have to engage in the work of refurbishing our imagination. That's theological labor. I think there are three partners in this peculiar form of interreligious dialogue. I think we know what two partners are, but not the third. One obvious form is the Christian church. The second, of course, is the indigenous communities. But the third unacknowledged partner that is setting the terms for the conversation is capitalism, global capitalism. I think it is a religious construction. And I have very serious arguments about why capitalism ought to be seen as a religion. On my account, to be religious is to answer the question, what should I do with my desires? What should I do with my desires? How do I rightly order my desires? What is worth desiring? Those are the fundamental questions of religious living. I can go all the way back to Augustine's discussion of what are the things in the world and how are they to be enjoyed or used, right? That is a fundamental question that Augustine frames religious life around. There are things in the world that can be enjoyed, and there are things to be used, and you should not confuse the two, and the human predicament revolves around how we disorder that relationship. Now, Augustine is quite wrong about many of the things he says on those issues, but that way of framing the issues reminds us that to be religious is to answer the question, what ought I and we to do with our desires? If we don't realize that markets and the structures of global capitalism are profoundly shaping our structures, we are caught up in profound ignorance. Because how we answer the question, what is worth desiring, is largely done for us by the market. The market has us while we dream. We learn to dream capitalist desires, including desires of ownership of land, ownership of home. These deep ways of forming desiring are holding us hostage. And if we fail to acknowledge that the desires of advertising, the desires of how our work is structured, how our identities are configured around what kind of life is worth living, all of those questions are being shaped by the market. The market is trying to teach me daily that I ought to hawk myself, that if I'm not an entrepreneur with myself as product, that I'm failing in organizing my desires so as to attain to a certain level of standard of living that makes it possible for me to retire, right? These kinds of ways of shaping desire are profoundly more powerful than what I can pull off in what Anglicans will permit me on Sunday mornings when I preach, which is about 12 minutes. Right? So if the church tries to shape your desires by a sermon that lasts 12 minutes and the market has you while you dream, you are massively outgunned as a priest. The Eucharistic practice might be a tonic that has some power. Thank God we do it every week. But if the market is shaping your desires as you sleep, even the power of the Eucharist might be attenuated. If you're inscribed inside a system of desiring that disrupts and reorders the legitimate desires that Christians affirm about what we ought to desire with respect to living in a right relationship to creation and the Creator. As it happens, Indigenous and Christian voices have considerable overlap on these issues if Christianity is disentangled from its complicity with capitalism. This is one of the critical tasks of the moment. It's important to remember that there are robust theological resources for reimagining our relationship with land. It's only starting from about the 18th century, post-Newton, that Christians came to believe that land was not enchanted, that the divine presence was absent from land. Even traditional doctrines of creatio ex nihilo do not mean that God is elsewhere. The theology, even of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, doesn't mean that the Creator is out there somewhere, but that at every moment creation is being sustained by its intimate participation in the divine life, right? So I'm sorry, the divine Miss M, Bette Midler, God is not watching us from a distance, a little karaoke for David Seljak in particular, right? That conception of a theological imagination that imagines God as elsewhere than here is relatively recent. It was a way of forming the theological imagination so that land could be reduced to property. If land is enchanted and held in common, it cannot be owned. So Christians had to be taught to rethink land as property. And I'm sorry to say that the Anglican Church played a critical role, together with post-Newtonian science, in teaching us to reimagine land as property and as disenchanted. Therefore, it is tremendously important for Anglicans to actually play a part in undoing that particular disfiguration of desire. I will close by just reading a little bit of what I think we ought to learn from. I won't tell you the source initially, but you'll learn something about the time when you listen to the language. You'll know who this is. Well, I know at least one person in this room knows who this is. But when once the earth becomes a common treasury again, as it must, for all the prophecies of Scripture and reason are circled here in this community, and mankind must have the law of righteousness once more writ in his heart, and all must be made of one heart and one mind, then this enmity in all lands will cease, for none shall dare to seek a dominion over others, neither shall any dare to kill another, nor desire more of the earth than another. For he that will rule over, imprison, oppress, and kill his fellow creatures, under what pretense soever, is a destroyer of the creation, and an actor of the curse, and walks contrary to the rule of righteousness. Skipping a little bit. Well, time is short, so let me not read it much more. This notion of the earth as becoming common property. Do we know where this is from? Anybody know? It's precisely. It is Gerard Winstanley, I think is the traditional English way of speaking. So Winstanley, in the True Leveler Standard Advanced, is making a profoundly Christian argument that is part of the heritage of the English past, since we are thinking as situated thinkers, right? How to bring Christian traditions and indigenous wisdom together. There are profound theological resources available in our traditions, not the established Anglican Church, but the dissenters, the levelers and the diggers, to whom we might need to turn to reimagine our relationship with earth so that we can have this new imagination that we so desperately need, that Carmen called for, to reimagine our relationship with earth and nature as commons. Without that work of reimagination, I think we are, in fact, in profound trouble, as Carmen argued. So just a few theological comments in response to the lawyers.
Thank you both for the richness of what that was. We've got some time for questions. I'll just remind you to please try to keep them brief, and so we can try to get a handful into to our speakers here. Anyone with one to start us off? Yep.
First off, thank you to Dr. Lansdowne for mentioning the financialization of housing, particularly in BC and in this city. The largest landlord is Starlight Investments, an investment firm out of Toronto, whose major dole of capital is coming from, I believe it's the Ontario Union of Teachers, who has the largest. So that's a direct instance of what you're talking about, just in terms of like how capital is almost independent of will now, and is just looking for opportunities to investment. And it's certainly like in the movements that we've seen of Starlight in this city and in other cities in BC, their modus operandi is they go in, buy up usually older purpose-built rental housing that was built in the 70s and 80s, back in the day when this country did have a national housing strategy, and those were purpose-built houses that were funded with government subsidies. Since government pulled out of, ended a national housing strategy around 1995, we've seen nothing but an increase in homelessness because there's no extra supply being handled in that. So thank you for naming that. One thing I did want to mention, particularly in relation to the conversations, the government employee union in this province actually has a pretty good strategy for fighting financialization in terms of looking at land tax, but is also has its own theological basis in the work of Michael Hudson, who wrote one of the definitive works on the Jubilee, just to add to the flavor of the conversation here. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. That was just fantastic. It's very, very inspiring. And I'm very intrigued, and I fully support your argument about religion and capitalism. And I want to ask both of you for your recommendations on how you begin to enlighten other people and make people who attend church and who don't attend really aware of this this relationship between religion and capitalism. How do we begin to move that forward and begin to discuss that subject?
She's the Pope of her denomination. She should.
I mean, I think John is exactly right. Even the moderator of the United Church of Canada is largely outgunned in this discourse, and I think that learning I have always been interested in economics. Before I got involved with the World Council of Churches, I thought I was going to do an MDiv honors and write my thesis on Christian ethics and the economy. So I'm an interdisciplinarian at heart, and so I read very, very broadly and deeply in some areas. But like reading economics and having conversations about all of the complexities of these systems and formations. So some of them are not even, like Sasson says, like some of them are not even systems. It's formations. It's like if you remember the show from the mid 2000s, Lost, where they had that like weird black cloud that would kind of like come through and kill people, or like make things happen. It's almost like those formations are like these shapeshifters. And I actually think the longer I serve the church and the longer that I try and have conversations with lay people who are not engaged in the academic study of some of these things, the more I think we have to turn to story. And that's another beautiful intersection between our traditional ways of being as Indigenous people, is why I started my talk with a story, is because it's stories that change our hearts. And so one of the things I'm doing, and you don't have to be United Church to join, I'm having a series of conversations over the next 2 years in 13 different cities across the country, where I'm inviting the business community to come and have conversations about reimagining what flourishing looks like in Canada, in part to have these conversations. Kindred Works, who some Anglican folks may know, is the property resource company of the United Church of Canada. They're our lead sponsors, so I can like ask people to sponsor the workshops and not have to explain why it's not a church thing, but they're writing a check to the United Church of Canada. But that's one part. But I'm also holding a national book club where we're going to read, I think it's like 17 books over 18 months, to use story, both fiction and nonfiction, and some poetry to have conversations as people of faith together. And starting with The Marrow Thieves, which, if you haven't read it, is a young adult novel by an Indigenous author named Cherie Dimaline, who writes this dystopian novel about white people losing their ability to dream. And so I'll just ask you right now, do you want to be the respondent for the first one?
You got me sold.
You already wrote your response, so. So I think like story for me is the big one, where, you know, to have heard these conversations and then to pick up the dynamics that we're talking about in story, I think is actually the main way for the church to engage. And it's where we engage with our imagination. And then there are really good resources around financialization, like Leilani Farha's documentary Push around the financialization of housing is a really accessible way to look at like what is happening globally with housing unaffordability specifically. And because so many of our churches want to redevelop in order to try and help preserve housing affordability in Canada, I think that's also a really good place to start. John?
A few quick thoughts. I want to again take off from Dr. Zeljak's great remarks yesterday. If we are in fact moving into something like a post-secular moment, one of the habits of living in a post-secular moment will be to realize that the compact we entered into in modernity that taught us to think that economics was not a matter of religious reflection at all, right? That religion is something that one does in private, and public matters like politics, economics, science, law, that these are constituted by secular reason. Right? Dr. Zeljak was making the argument that way of imagining the division of labor is perhaps falling apart. I think it is falling apart. If that way of thinking is falling apart, then the church needs to teach its own membership that we actually learn to make this distinction between the public and the religious, and we consign the economics to so-called experts, the economists. But the principles of those economic systems are bringing us to, life systems collapse. And therefore we need a reimagination of what we take economics to be, remembering again that the word is ours. That is, it was first a Christian word, right? Oikos. It has to do with the welfare of the household. That was the church's affair to reimagine right relations about the household, which is now the planetary household that we live in common with all creatures, not just with other humans. So reclaiming economics as our proper subject, getting competent at some of the systems that Carmen and Jason are talking about, like financialization. We've got to learn that. We cannot afford to be illiterate about these matters. So church groups really do need to say, oh, there are things we must do about how we how we imagine property, how we imagine finances, how we invest, how our own investments are actually accelerating the very cycles that we're just now talking about. If the teachers are contributing to the skyrocketing property costs here in BC, what teacher wants to do that? Their investments are driving themselves out of the possibility of home ownership. This is not a cycle that is sustainable. And I think if we knew these things, we would be able to begin to at least say, oh, okay, there are some radical interruptions to be made here. But let me just say that the theologians' bias to imagine that knowing alone is going to solve anything is ridiculous. Practices change people. Information doesn't. We need to be transformed, not merely informed. And that wisdom is actually held by churches. That's why we do Eucharist. We don't just yak at you as priests, right? It's our conviction that gathering around a common table, eating food together, sharing, that the disciplines of the body are the only hope for real transformation. That's a piece of wisdom that we can get from Indigenous communities too, who know this. I've never forgotten this. We are more tempted to forget this than, Indigenous people, I don't think ever did. So these are all things we must learn.
Thank you, Reverend Doctor, for this, especially for bringing to the fore the critique of capitalism and financialization in particular. And maybe just as a way to link the two panels, because, and I'm referring here to the Dene political scientist who's at UBC, Glenn Coulthard, who makes the link between terra nullius, the practice of the theory of terra nullius, and gentrification and financialization in our urban centers that he calls urbs nullius, right? This idea that the terra nullius idea is it's not that the land was empty, but it's that the people who inhabiting that land are not inhabiting it in the way that we believe they should, and therefore they effectively don't exist. So they're cleared out and new inhabitants come in. And it's really a parallel process that he sees in the gentrifications of our urban neighborhoods, where these working class folks, these usually racialized and indigenous folks, are not occupying these spaces in the way that the financial class wants them to. And so they are effectively treated as they're not there, displaced quite easily. And then that process of financialization of filling in that rent gap by getting that greater return for the sake of the shareholders that are benefiting from the REITs. But that parallel that he makes, I find very compelling, and it helps us to see, because we're all quite ready to acknowledge the horror of a notion of terra nullius, and yet what's happening still continually is a parallel process in our cities, and I think that's something we should be aware of as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
I don't want to, so I can't help but think of Swami Sarvapriyananda, the Vedanta Center in New York City, who said the purpose of religion is to die well. And the 99 calls to action, calling for a deconstruction of colonialist thought. And the Christian reality that our burial customs really have tied us to the land. I think of what the bishop said during the dispute, St. John Shaughnessy in court, and he said, you cannot underestimate the attachment of Anglicans to their buildings. So then I'm thinking about this reimagining the relationship with Earth and how the challenge is a theological reconfiguration of death in the way that it is expressed in burial customs in churches, including burial and scattering. And essentially, this is a theological question of the nature of divinity and the divisions between our theological thought and the location of divinity. Anyway, as a starting point, I just wondered if you could comment.
Yeah, great materials there. I think in a variety of indigenous communities globally, the tie to land is intimately connected to where our ancestors are buried. And so there is, this is really your area of speak, but in teaching theologies of land this semester, that was one of the key features of that I've learned, that indigenous communities reverence land in part because there are presences there that have been hallowed by the bodies of the ancestors and the spirits and the memories of those lands too. So I do think that thinking intimately about burial, which is itself another practice, right? If I'm saying our practices shape us more than our theologies, then I do think we need to think about what it is that we're doing when we bury our own, and why Anglicans don't think more about what it means to bury our people in land and how that shapes perhaps the sacrality of land. These are not issues we're thinking well about. So I think you've named something really important.
I hadn't actually thought about that, but there's, especially since Kamloops and this tangible issue of unmarked burials across the country on the sites of residential institutions, there's been something that has not been quite sitting right with me, and I couldn't articulate it, but I think you just hit the nail on the head. And so did you. There's been a huge Christian rush to exhume the bodies and repatriate them to where they're from, right? And I don't think that's what we are, as Indigenous people, are asking for. What we're asking for is for closure, for recognition, for commemoration. But where our children's bodies are buried is now sacred land, and it's not our way to go and say, oh, well, these remains are here and now they have to be moved over here, right? But that space now becomes a place where the transition of somebody's lived life to the spirit world is now commemorated in a sacred space. And I'm looking down too, but I don't think, I think I assume that the rush to want to move the bodies was also the white supremacist sense of urgency, right? We have to fix it. There's a problem, we gotta fix it. And I think actually that might be the socialized piece underneath it, besides just white supremacy and urgency, but that those bodies are in the wrong place. Right. So that's a really interesting thing, because I don't think that I know in historic territory, where the burial islands are, and I only had the experience of the huge amounts of loss in the 20th and 21st centuries, and the ways that Christianity has impacted our rituals around death and loss and commemoration. It's sort of like a hybridized thing where we have our traditional ways and we also have very Christianized rituals around death and burial. But never thought about actually the Euro-Christian practice of cemeteries and being attached to churches. And I understand from talking to the bishop last night that that was one of the things that had to be negotiated with Christchurch, was around if the land goes back to Indian Affairs to be held in trust for the Namgis, but like there has to be like the consecrated nature of the cemetery has to be respected in certain ways for the church to sort of give the land back, right? So it's interesting. Good question, Kate.
I have a question to Carmen. So my question is, what should be the first thing, just to pick one thing as the first step, to have the broader and thorough perspective on policy towards church finance and stewardship to really live within the safe and just and safe circle? What should be the first step to have the broader, thorough, comprehensive perspective on policy on finance, church finance and stewardship?
Thanks, Hannah. So in the United Church, I think this is something that we've been rumbling with for a while. I think of the 2006 Living in the Midst of Empire, which was sort of came out of global consultations on like the sustainable development goals and ecumenical global advocacy with the UN around that, the Jubilee movement. And like lots of good church reports, we approved it and then it went and sat on a shelf somewhere. And the majority of people don't know. And I think that that is, John, you touched on this too, around like being informed is not the same as being transformed. And so I think there's some flexibility in terms of the way that our polity works now, where we don't have to have a super prescriptive resolution that gets then like wordsmithed and amended. The way that we've shifted in the United Church to being able to make a proposal saying like, why is this important? What are the outcomes that we want to seek? What is the financial implications for the church of taking this action? So I think that the questions we should be having are principle-based questions. Like, I mean, we've already made a division to divest from fossil fuels through our foundation and our pension. Because I'm the moderator, I wrote to the director of finance and said, like, what's our situation with REITs and the pension? Like, is that something we've looked at? I think one of the big fights right now in that I see sort of brewing under the surface is people who favor a more hardline approach to financial activism like divestment versus people who see the benefits of shareholder activism. So when RBC said that, that proposal failed around the taking into account the climate implications of lending to oil and gas infrastructure, there's a huge movement of people in the United Church of Canada, some of whom have known me since I was in diapers and write me really angry letters about how could we not switch banks after that decision. I was really actually heartened to hear your comments and thinking like, well, maybe the government's just going to require them to take that into account at some point. So it's a non-issue. So there's a whole group of people in the United Church that are like, we can't bank with RBC anymore, anywhere. And we're going to pull our money from them. And my personal thought is that shareholder activism is actually more effective, because even though with all of our $4 billion worth of property and our $1.4 billion of pension fund, that's still like a drop in the bucket in terms of the Canadian economy. And I don't think that the RBC gives a damn about where our money goes and whether or not we bank with them. But if we can say we're going to reclaim a space of moral authority to come and talk about what does transformation in society look like, and we show up at an AGM and say, for the love of people and creation, we are saying that all of those other fiduciary responsibilities to your stakeholders, not just to hyper profitability, are important, and we value them and we want other shareholders to value them too. Like, that is a practice that we can do to help change the world. And so that's where I put my hope. I think there was a time when boycott and divestments worked. But I think that came out of industrial capitalism and not this financialization of everything. And so I think that having those conversations and taking back some democratic power and engaging with corporations directly, engaging with our governments is actually a more effective way to disrupt the systems.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's one of the first time I've heard someone make this direct connection between financialization of housing and land back, and I'm elated. And just maybe to build on Jason's comment recently, this is just an observation, but when we talk about financialization of housing, an observation I made recently is that all the countries in the top 10 of the worst housing crises with the most rampant and aggressive financialization are Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia, which I don't know if you get the shared origin story there, but it's terra nullius, doctrine of discovery, British colonization, and eviction through property, basically. So I think I just want to mention that, even though I'm not clear yet on, is it causality or correlation, get into the finesse of that. But I think when we move forward thinking about land back, it's not just a matter of restoring indigenous jurisdiction, but also this reckoning with this huge formation of extraction and this attitude of extraction of indigenous lands and then resources and then extraction of value from the land. So there's this kind of refusing a gesture of extraction and that also means restoring indigenous jurisdiction. But I think keeping them both in balance might be important moving forward. So you have maybe concluding thoughts to share on that.
Sure. I think all four, I mean, I don't know if it's causality or correlation, but all four countries have shared histories of mercantile rape and pillaging of the resources, and that like all of the exploration was motivated by access to the natural resources that existed in these countries, alongside like the shadow side of the British Empire, which was that the original settler migrants were expelled. Like they were the original expulsion, right? And I think, I watch some of these historical systems and think about the way that we repeat history. And in talking with some folks that come from like homesteading settler histories, like my dad's family, have a real resistance to being in any way associated with a history of colonization, because their people were hurt by the British Crown too, and that's how they ended up here. Especially Welsh, Irish, Scottish descendants, people who were expelled because of being dispossessed from their traditional clan lands in the British Isles, right? So there's this, it happened to me and now, so I don't care about it happening to somebody else dynamic that is a part of our human condition, is being played out at like a global scale across these four countries. So like tying that to the idea of extractions, I think there is another way. So in October, I spent 11 days in Philippines, and we have 6 formal partnerships with different ministries in the Philippines, and are doing a lot of work around obviously like peace and security, LGBTQ inclusion in the church, and now and also Indigenous land rights. And one of the things I was really privileged to do is to meet with people in the Cordillera in northern Philippines and talk with them and learn about traditional Indigenous gold mining, and which is still practiced today, but it's perceived as a threat to the really extractivist gold mining practices that are happening and the ways that they're using science to like, oh, now we can go back to our tailing ponds and like we can make it financially accessible to like things that would have been waste 30 years ago are now no longer waste, and they're hugely energy intensive. And I think, you know, do we really need that much gold? Or because I mean, even our jewelry, most of it is made from recycled gold, like jewelry, like gold that gets sold back to you know, estate sales and bought up and like melted down and refashioned into something else. How many bars of gold do we have sitting in like in reserves in different federal banks across the world? Like, could we stop for just a moment and invest in Indigenous mining and a more balanced way of doing things? And I wonder what our history of Indigenous mining was like in this country. And then I came home, and another plug for the book club, I read Charlie Angus's book Cobalt, which is about the history of Cobalt, Ontario, and their silver mining. And he starts with the intentional disappearance of Indigenous silver mining in Canada, and how there's archaeological record to show silver from cobalt that was used in jewelry in the southern United States that dates back to pre-contact. So we have that knowledge here too. So do we really need to amass so many resources so quickly? And I think with the advent of the internet and like, you know, tech companies and blitz scaling, like we always want to move faster, more, quicker. And what's wrong with slowing down and saying, we don't have to say we're never going to mine, but maybe we could mine less and slower in a way that is gentler on the earth. So I think there's so much to explore there about the ways in which our traditional worldviews can have been impacted specifically by British colonization, but the wisdom that we can offer back to disrupt it.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Lansdowne and Don Stanley